What is up, y'all? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt, and I am joined with my second guest on the show. Please welcome Worlds competitor, Sanctum for All team member, Ryan Condon. Ryan, how's it going?
Hello. It's going well. I am in that post-tournament recovery mode, as we were talking about just before we started recording. Definitely very tired post-Worlds.
Yeah.
But feeling good about, the process and being able to be back home and having a little rest.
Yeah, awesome. So I want to talk about your preparation for Worlds, the Team Sanctum's preparation for Worlds, specifically limited. We could talk about constructed too. I was a participant with Sanctum in the Worlds testing. I feel like I had a quite a small role. I was there kind of just to be there for limited, and you were the one that invited me, which thank you, by the way. I had a lot of fun. So do you want to talk through like big picture, like how you view testing for Worlds, or maybe even introduce Team Sanctum first of all?
Yeah, for sure. I can do a little bit of like background on kind of both things. So first off, I invited you to come help us out. Basically, for people who aren't familiar with it, most of our kind of testing process happens in Discord. We have our own sort of separate private Discord where we conduct all the constructed and limited prep for Worlds, and I invited Sam to join in on that, partially just as a limited expert and partially just as someone I have interacted with in the past preparing for tournaments and respect a lot as a limited player, and so wanted you to join in. The level of like participation is really kind of up to you, and everyone has a somewhat small contribution to the overall thesis on limited that our team develops, but I think yours was very, very valuable, especially just as someone with kind of an outside perspective, because I think on any team things can get pretty inbred. Brief intro to Sanctum for people who don't know. We are a professional Magic the Gathering testing team with an open invite basically to any players of marginalized gender, and that is a really broad definition. It basically just means anyone in the community who is not a cis white guy, which is still, not that large of a section of the community, but is a very broad and kind of open-ended thing. We just want to be a welcoming place for people to be, and an opportunity for people who qualify for regional championships or pro tours to have a really strong group of players to prepare with, and that being sort of a place for all that anyone can join, especially if they are marginalized in some kind of way, especially in the gender aspect in the community. And of course, we test with people who don't fit those kind of marginalization criteria all the time.
Like me.
We have tons of, like you, we have tons of people who are on the team or contribute to the team for that. And it's not really like a closed system by any means. It's really just kind of a group where that is the main focus. And we try to include everyone to a certain extent. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Sanctum's a great team. I basically got my start on the professional circuit through them. And we can talk about a little bit of my background and how I've kind of gotten to where I am.
We can take a step back because I realized I jumped right into Sanctum and forgot to give you space to introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. Always kind of awkward to be like, here's my sort of magic resume, I guess. But I have just been a really, really long time limited player. I started playing back in Rise of the Eldrazi, so 15 plus years ago at this point, when I was a kid in middle school and high school. And I've pretty much just been playing limited for the majority of that time. I was a competitive player trying to make the Pro Tour for most of that time. And, during the pandemic and when Arena became a much bigger thing, me and my roommate Maura started playing a lot of these Arena Opens. Shout out to the Arena Opens if they exist anymore, and just tried to play a bunch of competitive as high stakes arena as we could. And I found through kind of that the Limited Level Ups Discord, which I know you're a big part of too, one of the best limited podcasts out there, including this one. Those are my top two.
Yeah.
And that's just a great community. And kind of through that, I was playing in a bunch of these qualifier weekends, and I kind of spiked one, qualified for Arena Champs, did really well. You were actually, I believe, a filler for our drafts and our testing group for
I vaguely remember this. Yeah, I kind of remember interacting with you, because that was back when Arena Champs still had limited, right?
Yeah, does it not anymore? Oh, that's so
It doesn't.
sad.
No.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I could have on my resume that I am undefeated in Arena Champs Limited, and no one is ever gonna like come and take that from me. But yeah, so you helped with that, and that's kind of how I first was aware of you, getting to know you a little bit. And I also prepared with Ethan from Lords of Limited, another one of my top limited podcasts. Really love them too. And he was qualified for that Arena Champ, so I sort of got to know him, and then I placed second at that Arena Champs, and that qualified me for Worlds last year. And Ethan, who had worked with Sanctum for the first Pro Tour of that year, connected me with them, saying like, "Hey, you should reach out to Nor. She's like the organizational person for Sanctum." Mm-hmm. So I started working with them, and I've been doing that for the past year now, as I've been qualified for all of the Pro Tours in the past year and Worlds this year, and kind of become a big member of the team, I guess you could say. I'm trying to like help out a lot with them now, with like organizational stuff, and part of that is recruiting helpers for our Worlds testing process.
Yeah. So do you want to like give like a big overview of the sort of things that the team does to prepare for the limited portions of the Pro Tours and Worlds?
Totally. Yeah, I think this is sort of a process that many people might not be familiar with, because it's often very internal, and preparing for Constructed is what people hear about more from pro teams. But I think the biggest thing about preparing for Limited for a Pro Tour is that you normally have very little time. The Pro Tour is usually like 2 weeks after a set release, and so you'll have like a full spoiler maybe 3 weeks before the tournament. And for some perspective, obviously people are really excited to play on Arena and get sort of initial 17's lands data for the first week of the format, but people really don't know what's going on, and things don't really settle until a week and a half in, and at that point we are a couple days out of the Pro Tour. So you really have to get a pretty big lead on limited prep if you're really trying to be ahead of the PT competition. And so we try to start just kind of talking about the cards, organizing drafts, like really on Draft Sim, we'll have drafts as soon as the full set is released, as early as we possibly can. And really a lot of limited prep on a PT team is just about talking about the cards as early as possible. So one example of how Sanctum does this, I don't know if other teams do it in a similar way, is that we have this huge forum section on Discord called Individual Card Discussion, where literally every single card in the set has its own sort of thread, basically, and people comment on those threads saying, here's my initial read of the card, even before we've played any games with it, and then if you have a certain impression that changes, like, oh, I'm much higher on this than I was initially because it fits this role in this color or whatever, you kind of comment on that. We have channels where everyone sort of puts screenshots and draft logs of every deck that they draft, either in Arena or MTGO single limbs. Those are kind of the main two forums people get like practice in public for Limited. And we also, I think, probably the part that's going to be most unfamiliar for a lot of people is we really try to emphasize getting reps in pod drafts, which are very different from Arena Best of One.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that people sort of give lip service to. They say like, oh yeah, like Arena Best of One, it's just like different, and in an actual pod draft things are so more scrappy and that kind of thing. I didn't really believe folks when they were talking about this before I started preparing for Limited in the Pro Tour sense, but it really is just dramatically different to be in a pod with a bunch of high-level Limited players drafting. And, I wouldn't call every Pro Tour player high-level at Limited, but in general, the pods are just going to be, people know what's going on a lot more than on your, Arena client. And obviously Best of 3, very different from Best of 1 in the sense that you can sideboard, you don't have to hand smoother, there's lots of stuff going on. It really is dramatically different. And so we really try to have people play as many, like, single limbs on MTGO as possible. But we've also been thinking about, like, maybe that's not the best prep because you don't get to play that many games with each deck. If you lose round 1, you're just out. There's a lot of things to think about with that, but mostly what Limited looks like for preparing on a Pro Tour team is like, just imagine this huge section of Discord channels where all of them are really, really full of people talking about the format as much as you possibly can over like a 2-ish week period. And yeah, there's like a channel for draft logs specifically where people go and kind of comment like, I would have done this differently, pack 1, pick 1, pack 1, pick 5, whatever. And you can kind of go on. It's just a bunch of really good players talking about the format as much as they possibly can. And most of that happens over text, but some of it happens, of course, like on voice calls and stuff like that. And once you get into the house, you'll do like in-house morning drafts or draft log review at night, that kind of thing, which we were doing for Worlds. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have a big limited meeting, 2 big limited meetings actually, the day after deck submission. So once we don't have to worry about constructed anymore. I can talk about those more a little bit later, but.
Yeah, I just want, for people that don't know the Magic Online single elims, this is like something that Magic Online offers where it's in pod drafting. So it's full best of 3. I think the stakes are a little high, like the entry is a little higher or something. And you have to wait for everyone to finish round 1 before you get to round 2. So this is
such like an ancient concept.
Yeah, it's not league play. This is like the real deal in pod play. It's something that they don't really fire very often until it's like the week or 2 before the Pro Tour. But if you, dear listener, are trying to get better at limited and want to play with like tougher competition, I cannot recommend these enough. Like I'd been playing them occasionally, like before I was helping test for this, and I did a bunch when I was helping test as well. And they're really fun. They're really difficult. You get to play against a lot of pro players that week. So I think they're great.
Yeah, if we could use this as like a little bit of an advertisement for these single elims, I really would like to. You know, I do want to say they're very challenging and they're very costly if you aren't succeeding at them, which they're, very challenging, so it's hard to. But I do think people who listen to this podcast, I don't want to overstate it, but I think are probably pretty competitive with the average Pro Tour player in terms of limited. And I think some of you probably have a lot of listeners who would really, really like the opportunity to just play against some of the strongest Magic players in the world. And I don't really want to exaggerate it, but like these pods don't fire that often because the only people who are really playing in them are like Worlds competitors.
Yeah.
you really get a very, very, very high level of competition. And I think I both have like a personal interest in wanting these to fire more because they're the best way to practice limited. And I think other people would really enjoy them. So I do want to give them a shout out.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a difference in your testing, like in person versus via text or via voice chat? Because I know that almost every pro team sort of gets into the testing house the week of in person and obviously runs like drafts in paper and then gets to talk about them. Do you feel like those are especially helpful, or is that mostly for getting people on the same page?
Yeah, we usually have a little bit of a debate over this on the team of like how many in-person drafts is really useful compared to spending that time on constructed. I personally tend to fall on the side a lot more of like, I just want to know how to play with the cards and what to draft and how to build a good deck. I don't need like paper reps, as people would call them. Mm-hmm. Other people find those a lot more helpful. I think there is an aspect of like, if you haven't done a called draft before, like a timed called draft where a judge is saying, pick up your pack, you have 40 seconds, draft, pass the next pack or whatever. That can be kind of a psychological factor that is important for people to just get used to when they're preparing for a Pro Tour, because that's going to be the environment they're in when they're actually drafting their deck, and it can be very different from just sitting at a computer on your own.
And you also don't get to like look at your picks while you're drafting. Yes. You have to like draft face down.
That is a huge thing, and that's something definitely to get used to. Part of what you can do is you can like drag your window down on Magic Online so you don't actually see your picks in between packs. People do that. But it is just a very different experience to like not be able to look at your picks except in between packs. I tend to feel like I don't get that much more out of in-person drafts, like playing in paper. Intuitively, it just doesn't really matter. I think to me, it doesn't feel like it matters. Knowing how the cards work is all I kind of need. But I get why people feel that it's important to try to draft in person, and like a good opportunity to do this is also, you know, an RCQ sealed top 8 or whatever, if you guys are lucky enough to have those in your area, where you can ask the judge to do a called draft, and hopefully if you have a nice judge, they'll oblige you, even if some people might grumble about it. That's a fun way to do it, but there aren't that many opportunities to get like a called in-person draft going, and that it can be a very fun environment when everyone's like taking it super seriously.
Yeah, I've actually never done one, but I have a couple competitive events scheduled for Lorwyn next year, and I'm pretty excited to at least try to get to the call draft stage. So,
yeah, I guess the other opportunity for that would be like the day 2, the top 32 of those PTQs they run at Magic Cons. I haven't made it to one of those, but that sounds like it would also be a really fun opportunity.
Yeah. I want to circle back to when you were talking about how different in-pod drafting, best of 3 drafting, like high stakes drafting is versus like just drafting on Arena. Because I feel like that it's the type of thing where the fundamentals are going to be the same, obviously. But I think it's a lot of little things that add up. And tell me how you feel about this, but like obviously no hand smoother. Best of 3 is a whole thing with sideboarding. Everyone's card evaluation is better, so you're getting past like fewer good cards. Do you want to like talk about how that differs, like, and how you still use? Because I know you still like people are still drafting on Arena Ladder to prepare for these tournaments.
Yeah, a lot of us still do, and I think it's always a balance between getting the most practice you can and getting the best practice you can. And like, don't get me wrong, Arena Ladder is still very difficult to do well on. It still really matters how well you can build a good deck and value the right cards in the draft. But I do think people, even though it's said by a lot of pro players, at least I underestimated it, like I said earlier, how different an actual sort of high-level pod draft where everyone is in the know is versus just drafting on Arena. So the most important things I would say are that you just get fewer good cards. All of the good cards are kind of hoovered up very quickly, and this doesn't always look like just the cards that are bombs or like objectively powerful. This can look like certain kinds of cards being much more contested than they might be on Arena. For example, like 2-drops is one thing that we were very, very laser focused on.
That's the one that
prep
jumps out to me the most, switching into doing like pod drafts on Magic Online, is you have to take 2-drops like almost as high as you take removal.
Yep, totally. And removal was going to be the other one I mentioned, of like in certain sets when good removal is more scarce, you can absolutely see that dry up very quickly in a high level pod. And it kind of depends on the set and which types of cards are more scarce, but basically the fundamental thing going on in a pod draft is every type of card that you need to make a deck work is more scarce. And so what tends to happen with that is that I think a lot of the times on Arena, and this is probably what happens in the like limited content discourse a lot of the time, people don't adjust strongly enough. The general population never adjusts strongly enough to counteract whatever the best decks are in a format. So like for Avatar, blue and white were the strongest colors, and to this day, you know, in most Arena drafts, you will be able to get some collection of pretty strong blue and white cards. The people drafting on the public, you know, Arena servers are just, they might value the blue and white cards a little bit higher, and you'll run into people using 17 lands and doing that, but you kind of have to get into a draft where everyone is being super cutthroat about what they value the most until you really get this dynamic of like, yeah, even though all the like the white cards, the commons are much deeper, and the blue cards, the commons are just very strong overall, I could easily have a draft where even if I said I'm just going to force blue-white, I like literally would not be able to create a functional deck from that. And so what that means is that it's much harder to force things, and you definitely have to work more with like the underrepresented colors and strategies. Like black sacrifice decks, I think, were consistently doing pretty well in these single elim pods when people might not really think of those as something that does super well in general in the format if you just look at like Arena data. I could be getting some of these things wrong. I'm not super clued
No,
into
that's very,
the
very
actual
true.
dynamics right now. But yeah, I think generally you just have to kind of have a wider range of cards that you are able to make work. You really need to get into like the C minuses, the D pluses, and know what decks they perform important functions in, even if you're not happy to be playing them. You just can't assume that you're going to get like a smooth, streamlined deck without any flaws every time.
Right. The Avatar might not be the best format to ask this question, just because I feel like this format doesn't have like super streamlined synergy decks. But in like other formats, do you feel like you're often avoiding like these big synergy decks that have like pieces that are hard to get, for more fundamental, like just bread and butter mid-range Magic?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I would say that like Avatar as a set sort of pushed us all in that direction organically, and it's maybe a little bit more pronounced in single limbs, but it's sort of fundamentally what's happening anywhere you play the format, where like the bread and butter, limited curve out, get on board, cabs theory, that kind of thing, like really dominated that strategy. But I do think in other sets, you're right that like the decks that are just harder to put together, where you need more kind of wiggle room in the draft to be able to select between multiple different good cards to like build a deck that actually synergizes correctly. Those decks can be possible to put together in high level pod drafts because, you know, if everyone is really like narrowed in on valuing the like good cards, there might be a synergy space that sort of gets undervalued or slips under the radar, and you can really like hoover up all of the cards that only go in this like one particular package. But at the same time, it can go the opposite way, where if people like just know that, I'm not thinking of a good example right now, but there's this like one card that is very good in a certain archetype but pretty unplayable outside of that, and they're looking at a pack with, you know, a bunch of really bad commons, they might just speculate on that card because they know that like, yeah, I could end up in this archetype, this could end up being open. And so that's kind of what's going on at the same level, like at every stage of the pack in these pod drafts. People are just sort of more ruthlessly accumulating all of the cards with any amount of possibility to be played in any deck. That's the best way I can describe it, is like each card has a certain amount of value in the format of like, it can be played in certain decks and be valuable in those decks, and the amount of value you see per pack just gets reduced in these pod drafts because there's no one kind of leaking that value anywhere. I also just wanted to have a moment to ask you, like, what was your impression of the PT process? Had you been involved in a Worlds, or not a Worlds, just like a limited Pro Tour team before? And also on Constructed, like, what were your notions coming in, and how were those maybe challenged a little?
Yeah, I'd never done something like this before. I had, like I said, I have been like, I was joining in on the single limbs when for certain sets when I had time. Obviously, that's a time commitment, so I can't do it every set. So I had like experience like playing these types of drafts a little bit, just from playing these. But I'd never like been part of like a serious testing process for a tournament like this. I think what stuck out to me was it was a lot more little bits and pieces of limited coming through over the couple of weeks before the tournament. Like when you think of like PT testing for limited, you think about the stories about they lay every single card out on the table and sort of organize it by pick order. And I was struck that it seemed like people were very focused on Constructed, because I think that's more rounds than limited, obviously. And it's a puzzle that has, like, we obviously just had the big standard bans. It was like a very unknown metagame. People were trying to find certain decks and do a lot of testing. And not that there wasn't a focus on limited, it was just there was less like direct communication between people on limited. It was a lot of like residual, like, I'm just going to drop a comment on this one card, which I hope this doesn't sound like a criticism of the process at all. It was just what I was thinking about. That was just like my impression of the limited testing. And I'm wondering if this was mostly the case for this specific Worlds tournament, which I think seemed to be a very challenging constructed metagame, versus like a Pro Tour that is maybe like modern, where a lot of the decks are established. And like obviously there's tuning to do to predict the metagame, but a lot of the reps are going to be just like you individually learning each individual deck and how to perform.
Yeah, you're right to have that like overall perception. And I think there were a bunch of factors that kind of led it so that we didn't actually spend as much explicit time on limited, structured time on limited, as we normally would for a Pro Tour for this Worlds compared to most. So like one of the things you might think of is just that there aren't really any sort of truly new limited players for Worlds, where there might be for a Pro Tour, where you can fully qualify for a Pro Tour from constructed and never really have to play any high level or really any limited. And so when our team has a lot more of those newer players, there certainly is more kind of didactic, like here's how to draft a fundamentally solid deck, here's how to do well in this format kind of thing. There was a little bit of that, but it was much more, like you're saying, kind of interspersed. It was also just true, like you mentioned, that this was a very quick turnaround for like bans to new set that was very powerful to Worlds and needing to submit deck lists time and constructed. And so we honestly probably got a little bit too wrapped up in constructed testing and kind of were panicking on that going into the last week. And so didn't end up spending as much time on limited as we could have. And then also I think there's this dynamic that happens a lot on Sanctum specifically, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate around this as we go on, where we have some players, and this was still true for Worlds, who are sort of these like long-time limited players who sort of are comfortable with what they're doing and have their own process and figure things out on their own. And players who probably have played a lot of limited and are strong, solid limited players, but don't really consider themselves like limited experts. And it's harder, I think, to sort of communicate information if you're like a long-time limited expert. I mean, you do an incredible job of this. You, Alex, and Ethan and Ben all do incredible jobs of this, but like it is truly hard to do. You can't really teach limited in a very clear, concise way. And so we struggle with like how much the more expert players on the team want to sort of give explanations for how to do things that aren't going to be 100% accurate, because a lot of what they're doing is very nuanced and context-based and intuition-based. And so there's probably a lot less like telling you what to do in the limited process, and a lot more people just being like, the vibes on this card are moving up or down for X intuitive reason or Y intuitive reason.
Because I could be like, I love this card, it's great, and it's like a C+, and it's like, well, when do I pick it? Like, what decks is it good in? There's like so much.
And someone will see that and pick two. They'll be like, oh, well, Sam loves this card. He's a great limited player. Let me take it. And you're like, well, I wouldn't take it in that spot because you really need this or something.
That was one of the other things that struck me was there was a big focus on, especially towards the last week, there's a bigger focus on draft log review than just card evaluation.
Yeah, that is something that I've pushed really hard for in Sanctum's process, mostly just because I think draft log review falls under the category of magic prep and improvement and practice that like is really hard to get yourself to do, because it's not as exciting as starting a new draft. But at least personally, I found that it's really, really helpful for me just to see how other strong players navigate a draft in a particular format and what they're valuing. To me, it's so much more helpful to say, like, okay, why did you feel like you could switch colors here? Or why did you feel like you needed to sort of hold on to your best rare even though the color wasn't clearly open, or something like pack 2, pick 3, or pack 1, pick 8, or whatever, instead of just talking about that I think a lot of the traditional people would assume a limited team process is like, where you're just trying to figure out a ranking of all the cards.
Yeah.
That is useful in the extent that, like, you can figure out what to take early on in, like, pack 1 to be like, what is the power that I'm going to try to build around in this draft? But a lot of the places you can get tripped up are just these later kind of navigation questions of, do I feel like I have enough low end, or do I need to really prioritize this 2-drop over a card that we sort of consider objectively more powerful? later. And yeah, draft log review, I basically think that anyone who wants to improve at Limited, get a good drafter and have them just go over your logs and say, I would have done something different here, and then you can ask them why. They might not be able to give a fully coherent explanation, but they'll give you something.
And draft log review works both ways too, where if you are trying to improve and you are getting your own draft log reviewed by someone who's better than you, or maybe not even better than you, by someone else, that's helpful. And then you looking at someone else's draft log can also be a tool to improve your own game by copying them and picking up on what they're doing.
And you can look at different paths during the draft log review, right? You can say, like, what happens if you take the green card, pack 1, pick 3, instead of the white card, so that you have this lane open for you. You can kind of option into that. And then what green cards would you have had access to throughout the rest of the draft, and could we build a green deck, through your draft, even if you didn't actually take any of the green cards? That kind of thing can be really helpful. You can sort of branch off into multiple realities. There's just a lot that you can get. And I kind of agree with the framing that it's not often as much about like a player who's just objectively better than you at a format, but someone who has a different perspective than you on what to value in a format can really just help you be like, okay, let me try to imitate them, see how it goes, and see like what sort of categories of cards or decks am I missing and not really seeing in the draft. That can be super helpful too. So It just gives you like a way to kind of inhabit someone else's mind in a draft.
Right.
In a way that you can't really do for limited gameplay or just like a pack 1, pick 1.
So similar to draft log review and improving that way, do you have any thoughts about gameplay in Limited? Because from what I've seen, especially like watching the high stakes like world matches or pro tour matches, it seems like the gameplay aspect of it, like you have to play perfectly to compete with these people who are the best in the world. And it seems like that's a really, really big factor in a deck's performance, probably way more important than it is on just playing like Arena Ladder or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, gameplay is huge, and it's like even less teachable than limited card evaluation somehow. I think at least the thing that comes to mind from Worlds coverage that maybe you were watching and thinking of when you said that, maybe this is just a different thing that I was thinking of, but Derek Davis and how he 2-1'd with this like really crappy looking blue-black deck on day 2 in this stacked pod, where he like bluffed a quench multiple times in situations where it didn't really make sense for the opponent to play around it, but the way he was doing it just kind of ended up working out. Anyway, going on a little bit of like a tangent there, but limited gameplay is so important and so freaking impossible to teach. Like, there's just no good kind of lesson to give someone other than just play a lot of really high-level limited and really try to think about your decisions. I don't know. It obviously helps to be on a pro team and just have like other people to play against and play single limbs and, just try to play against as good players as you possibly can. But I do think, and genuinely, like, it is hard, but that's because it's really teaching you Magic fundamentals. And even if a lot of these like pro-level players, I think a lot of people and limited players in the limited community genuinely do probably draft a little bit better and evaluate cards a little bit better than the average Pro Tour player, which is a kind of a weird dynamic going on. But those pro players, just because they're strong Magic players in general, make up for that in their gameplay a lot, which I think people don't really see often and kind of goes underrated. Some of members of our team had very, very strong decks after their like Worlds Day 1 drafts. And I looked at them and I was like, yeah, this deck is great. And after the game, some people were like, oh man, Worlds is just incredibly tough. I mean, that's sort of obvious, but any really strong deck can easily lose in these high-level drafts. And it's really because you have to be tight as nails with your gameplay and just eking out every little advantage, making sure that you're playing around, cards that don't seem super likely, but you can afford to play around. There's just, these things that are really difficult and hard to teach. And the only really thing you can do is just practice a lot and try to find the best competition you can.
That ties back into the decks at these high level tournaments being more like fundamental Magic, like less tied to the individual set, more just you're playing like a mid-range deck all the time with lower synergy most of the time. I think when all of the decks kind of look like that, it makes sense to me that the gameplay matters that much more in the actual tournament, as far as like getting an edge, because when you're on the ladder, like if you could draft a busted deck, and a lot of times it's just gonna like cruise you to a trophy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you sort of know how to draft the best cards or the best deck, the best archetype in a format, you can sort of like repeatedly iterate that advantage over and over every time as you play on ladder. The players in Mythic, there are some extremely strong limited players, especially in high level Mythic, but you will just run into people who didn't end up drafting the like hyper optimized thing, and they're just going to be at a big disadvantage from you. But if you're scrapping for every pick and every like 2-drop in your deck, it just matters so much more what you do with your cards, because everyone is kind of on the same playing field.
Yeah. So in terms of gameplay being so important, do you feel like that translates really well into Constructed? Do you feel like there's a lot of Constructed fundamentals that you've pulled into your limited game after playing a lot more Constructed in the past couple of years than I'm sure you had before that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I love Limited, and I'm a longtime Limited junkie, and so I might be a little bit biased in my answer here, but I really do think that I've been able to do pretty well on the Pro Tour because of this long, like literally more than a decade background in playing and really trying to think about, consume content about Limited. I think Limited is the best way, just playing a lot of it and trying to understand it as well as you possibly can. It's the best way to understand the fundamentals of the game. And I sort of maintain and have, like in a lot of my writing, that just being a strong, experienced limited player is so much more translatable to Constructed than the inverse. I have some teammates like Paul Green, shout out, who has been a long-time Constructed player and has been learning Limited at a scarily fast and impressive rate this year. But I think he's more of the exception than the rule. I think like a long-time Constructed player who's trying to prepare for a high-level Limited tournament is going to have a much harder time than a long-time Limited player who's picking up Constructed, even though that's obviously also difficult and intimidating. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of talked a lot in this episode about how, oh yeah, like the pros are so good and yada yada, like it's just all at such a different level. I don't want to exaggerate that too much, because a lot of the difference between, pro level Magic and sort of store level Magic is really just that people have different amounts of time and sort of reason to prepare for these events. And so like when you put in the time, if you have this long-term background, you can succeed at sort of any level of event. It's much more about how well you prepared for any specific one tournament. With the big caveat that I think just being a limited sicko is a really, really, really good way to have that like background that lets you sort of succeed in any context in Magic. And, podcasts like this one and podcasts like Limited Level Ups and Lords of Limited, I really do think the people listening to those podcasts are probably a lot closer to success in competitive Magic, if that's something that they want to really achieve, than they might think. This kind of thinking about the game, at least for me personally, having been someone who wanted to make the Pro Tour for a long time but sort of never really thought I was quite good enough, once I sort of randomly spiked an event, it really felt like all of this background, all of this just obsession over Limited for many, many years helped me tremendously in just like being a fundamentally strong Magic player who enjoys thinking about the game. So yeah, I just wanted to give like a shout out to being a Limited sicko, because it's really fun, and I'm sure there are a lot of people here who identify with that.
That's awesome, and that's really encouraging to hear, especially because of the limited, what is it called? The Limited Championship that's coming in 2027.
I know, oh, it's so exciting.
I'm trying to qualify. I referenced the couple paper tournaments I have next year. Those are trying to qualify for that in part. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are going to be trying to qualify for that as well. So yeah, it's an exciting time to be a limited player. And I know that just like process and the work that you put in is a big part of your writing too. And I can't believe we've gone this far and not mentioned that you write articles, like really good articles too.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I write a lot on Patreon. It's kind of just the place I found that was easily able to host things and have people able to support me if they want to kind of help me out in playing Pro Magic and trying to produce content about it. So yeah, I have a Patreon. It's Ryan C MTG if people want to go check it out.
Perfect plug. Look at that. Anything else you want to talk about before I wrap us up?
Not really. I just wanted to say thank you for having me on. I think this podcast is awesome. I really, really love Rough Drafts and how it fits into the limited content space. Just getting into the really grindy details of like how to evaluate this particular card that might be undervalued at this point in the format and what it says about how people are drafting in general and what sort of underrated strategies there can be. That is the kind of stuff I love. I mean, I'm a person who used to listen to 6-hour limited set reviews, right? And even though this is only half an hour every week, it feels like the amount of detail and depth that is hard to produce content about because people just kind of want to know, like, what's the best deck and how do I draft it? What's the pick order for it? But yeah, I mean, I really think this is the kind of podcast I would have loved listening to when I was in middle school and still love listening to today.
I really, really thank you. I really, really appreciate it. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you? You already plugged your Patreon, which was Ryan C MTG, I believe.
Yep. And then I also sort of my public Magic social media stuff is I technically have a Twitter. I'm not even going to call it X, but I don't really use it anymore besides to just post my articles directly. So I'd rather if people found me on either Blue Sky, which is r-condon.bsky.social, or Discord. People can feel free to reach out to me. My handle there is just Ryan H. Condon.
Perfect. Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
No, that's it. I mean, thank you so much for being part of our Worlds Prep, and you've already joined the PT Lorwyn server, so I hope you can
I'm
be
looking
part of
forward
that
to
too. It's gonna be so fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. If you want to reach out to me, Sam, you can find me on, also not on Twitter, on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social and on Discord at samp6. Thanks for listening. See you next week.